I'm sorry we didn't get as many in as normal. We've got to move over to questions to the Prime Minister. I'm now going to call the Prime Minister, where it will be beneficial if the Prime Minister is to answer his engagements. I will then call Stephen Furry to ask his supplementary. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the last 12 months have been the most difficult for a generation, and I know that the thoughts of the whole House are with all those who have lost loved ones during the pandemic. I also want to pay tribute to every person in this country for playing their part, whether working on the front line, staying at home to prevent the spread of the virus, or working on vaccine development and supply. And it's that vaccination programme that has brought hope, allowing us to set out the cautious but irreversible roadmap out of lockdown. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's go to Stephen Furry. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many independent countries, from Switzerland to New Zealand, have bilateral veterinary agreements with the European Union and face lower non-tariff barriers than the UK, despite our very high standards. With the Food and Drink Federation reporting a massive drop in UK food exports, over 90% in some areas, and furthermore SPS checks constituting the main challenge for the Northern Ireland Protocol, surely the Prime Minister should be making it a priority to negotiate a bespoke UK-EU veterinary agreement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly why we put in the temporary and technical measures that we have to allow free trade to continue across the whole of the UK. And it's very, very important for those who object to the measures that we have taken that the protocol should uphold the principle of east-west trade as well as north-south trade, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Sussex, by the end of this week, we will have delivered 1 million COVID jabs. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the local vaccine heroes, in particular Adam Doyle and his leadership in Helsham, Charlotte Lack in Uckfield and Dr Susie Padgham in Crowborough? And will the Prime Minister agree with me that the UK's success is built on the confidence that people have in the fantastic vaccine technology, and should and when our constituents get contacted for a vaccination, they should definitely take up the first available appointment?
Well, I can certainly join her, my honourable friend, in paying tribute to Adam Doyle and Charlotte Luck and Dr Susie Padgham for all their efforts, and she's completely right in what she says about the foundations of the UK's vaccine success. And I had my jab on Friday, Mr. Speaker. I know whether you've had yours, or you certainly have, but I know he has had his. I encourage everybody to get it.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start with joining the Prime Minister in his remarks about yesterday's day of reflection for the 126,000 people who lost their lives to COVID? That's a shocking number, and behind every one of those numbers is a grieving family. As soon as restrictions lift, there must be a full public inquiry, because that is the only way we can get to the bottom of the many mistakes that were made during the pandemic and find justice for those who've suffered so much. Mr. Speaker, why did the Prime Minister promise at the last election that he would, and I quote, not be cutting our armed services in any form?
Mr. Speaker, that was because what we were going to do was actually increase spending on our armed services by the biggest amount since the Cold War, £24 billion, modernising our armed forces, keeping with no redundancies, Mr. Speaker, keeping our army at 100,000 if you include the reserves. And I must say, I take it slightly amiss from the right honourable gentleman when he stood on a manifesto to elect a man who wanted to pull this country out of NATO, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he's fighting the last war, but Is he trying to pretend, hidden in that answer, that the army stands at over 100,000, the number the Prime Minister quoted there, because it's absolutely clear from the Secretary of State for Defence's statement that I think he made here on Monday. He was absolutely clear. His words, "I have therefore taken the decision to reduce the size of the army to 72,500 by 2025. Only this Prime Minister could suggest that a reduction from 82,000 to 72,000 is somehow not a cut. But the Prime Minister didn't answer my question, which was why did he make that promise? He said, before the last election, Prime Minister, all very well looking up, we will not be cutting our armed services in any form. What did he do this week? He cut the British Army by 10,000, he cut the number of tanks, he cut the number of planes for our RAF, and he cut the number of ships for the Royal Navy. I say he, the Prime Minister didn't have the courage actually to come to the House himself to say what he was doing. So let me ask the Prime Minister a simple question. Going back to that promise before the election, did he ever intend to keep his promise to our armed forces?
No. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only did we keep our promise in the manifesto, we actually increased spending by 14% more than that manifesto commitment. And again, Mr. Speaker, I think it frankly satirical to be lectured about the size of the army, when the Shadow Foreign Secretary herself only recently wrote that the entire British Army should be turned into a kind of peace corps, Mr. Speaker. And when, as I say, the leader of the opposition stood on a manifesto wanted to elect a leader who himself wanted to disband the armed services. This is a massive investment in our defences and in our future, and it's wonderful to hear the new spirit of jingo that seems to have enveloped some of the Labour benches. They don't like it Upham, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Let's try this for Upham, because the Prime Minister might want to avoid the promises he made, but I found an interview he gave during the general election campaign. Under the headline, here's the headline, "No troop cuts. Tories will maintain size of armed forces." It then goes on to quote the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson has promised that he will not make any new cuts to the armed forces. He also promised, might want to listen to this, Prime Minister, he also promised to maintain numbers at their current level, including the Army's 82,000. Now, I know the Prime Minister's got form for making up quotes, but can he tell us, does he think the newspapers have somehow misquoted him, or does he now remember making that promise?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, because there will be no redundancies in our armed forces, and I said to him, if you include reserves, we're even keeping the army at 100,000. But on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we're doing what is necessary to modernise our armed forces, taking them into the 21st century, building more frigates, Mr. Speaker, investing in cyber warfare, Mr. Speaker, doing all the difficult things that Labour shirked during their time in office, including, Mr. Speaker, modernising and upgrading our nuclear deterrent, which again, half the shadow front bench would like to remove, leaving Britain defenceless internationally.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I have every respect for our reservists, but the Prime Minister is just playing with the numbers. He knows very well that the numbers have been cut. The trouble is you just can't trust the Conservatives to protect our armed forces. Let's look. Mr. Speaker, let's look at their last manifestos. These are the manifestos that those opposites stood on. The 2015 manifesto.
Order. I'm struggling to hear the Leader of the Opposition, and I will hear the Leader of the Opposition, so please, I want the same respect to the Prime Minister as I respect for the Leader of the Opposition. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2015 manifesto. We will maintain the size of the regular armed services. The 2017 manifesto. We will maintain the overall size of the armed forces. 2019, the Prime Minister. We will not be cutting our armed services in any form. But the truth is, since 2010, our armed forces have been cut by 45,000, and our army will now be cut to its lowest level in 300 years. Let me remind the Prime Minister and members opposite why this matters. Lord Richards, former Chief of Defence Staff, has warned that with an armed force of this size now, we almost certainly wouldn't be able to retake the Falklands or stop genocide. He says it's rubbish. That's Lord Richards, Prime Minister. After 10 years of Conservative government, is the Prime Minister not ashamed of that?
Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government is massively proud of the investment that we've made in our armed forces, which, as I say, is the biggest uplift since the Cold War. And he should look at what the NATO Secretary-General had to say about our investment, which is absolutely vital for the future success of the alliance and, indeed, for the security of many other countries around the world. A £24 billion investment in the future combat air system and use Army Special Operations Ranger Regiment, £1.3 billion to upgrade the Challenger main battle tanks, massive investment in the Typhoon squadrons, and so on. We're investing in the future, Mr. Speaker, and yes, of course, we've had to take some tough decisions, but that's because we believe in our defences and we believe that they should be more than merely symbolic. And it's the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, who are consistently, historically, hilarious to be lectured about the Falklands, Mr. Speaker, consistently weak on protecting this country, and you heard it. It was most visible last week, Mr. Speaker, during the debate on the integrated review, when it was plain that the shadow front bench couldn't even agree to maintain Britain's nuclear deterrent. Absolutely true, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, what's weaker than making a promise to our armed forces just before the election, then breaking it and not being prepared to admit it, not having the courage to admit it? And there's a pattern here, Mr. Speaker. He promised the NHS that they would have, quote, whatever they need. Now nurses are getting a pay cut. He promised a tax guarantee. Now he's putting taxes up for families. He promised he wouldn't cut the armed forces. Now he's done just that. So if the Prime Minister is so proud of what he's doing, so determined to push ahead, why doesn't he at least have the courage to put this cut in the armed forces to a vote in this House?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of what we're doing to increase spending on the armed forces by the biggest amount since the Cold War. The only reason we can do that, Mr. Speaker, is because under this Conservative government we've been running a sound economy, and it's also because we believe in defence. We've been getting on with the job. He talks about nurses and investment in the NHS. I'm proud of the massive investment that we've made in the NHS, and actually we have 60,000 more nurses now in training, and we've increased their starting salary by 12.8%. We're getting on with the job, Mr. Speaker, of recruiting more police, 20,000 more police. I think we've done 7,000 already, while they're out on the streets, Mr. Speaker, at demonstrations shouting, "Kill the bill," Mr. Speaker. That's the difference. That's the difference between his party and my party. We're pro-vax, Mr. Speaker, we're low tax, and when it comes to defence, we've got your backs, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just say, I genuinely mean this. I do not believe any member of Parliament would support that kill the bill. I've got to be very careful of what we say. I say we are all united in this House in the support and the protection that the police do offer us, and nobody would shy away from that. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question, Prime Minister, is why not have the courage to put it to a vote? That question, of course, was avoided, Mr. Speaker, like all of the questions. And we all know why he won't put it to a vote. Let me quote his Conservative MP, Chair of the Defence Select Committee, because he recognises, and he has experience and respect across the House, he recognises that this review means dramatic cuts to our troop numbers, tanks, armoured fighting vehicles and more than 100 RAF aircraft. And he goes on to say, your MP, Prime Minister, cuts that, if tested by a parliamentary vote, I do not believe would pass. Not me, his own MPs. Mr. Speaker, can I say this? Because I want to turn to another issue that affects thousands of jobs in many communities across the country. 5,000 jobs are at risk at Liberty Steel, with many more in the supply chain. The UK steel industry is under huge pressure, and the government's failure to prioritise British steel in infrastructure projects is costing millions of pounds in investment. So will the Prime Minister now commit to working with us and the trade unions to change this absurd situation, to put British Steel first and do whatever is necessary to protect those jobs?
Mr. Speaker, I'll just remind, I'm of course happy to cooperate in any way, but the steel output halved under the Labour government. I share very much the anxiety of families of steel workers who work in Liberty Steel, and that's why my honourable friend, the Business Secretary, has had, I think, 3 meetings just in the last few days with Liberty Steel to take the question forward, see what we can do. We are actively engaged. We're investing huge sums in modernising British Steel, British Steel plants, and making them more environmentally friendly. But we have a massive opportunity, Mr. Speaker, because this government is engaged on a £640 billion infrastructure campaign. HS2, the great Dogger Bank wind farms, Hinkley, all the things that we're now building, the Beeching Railway reversals, all the things that we're doing across the country, they will call for millions and millions of tonnes of British steel. And now, Mr. Speaker, thanks to leaving the European Union, we have an opportunity to direct that procurement at British firms in the way that we would want to do. Whereas I know that the right honourable gentleman would like nothing more than to take this country back into the European Union and remove that opportunity for British steel and British steel workers.
Miller.